Having just looked at a very typical antique example, let's have a look at this modern recreation intended for fencing in historical European martial arts. While the blade is flat in order to remain flexible and safe for sparring, it is what is called a Colichemarde blade. This also features the aforementioned bilobate hilt. Colichemarde blades have a pronounced widening in the fort of the blade, which assists in harmonics, parrying, and stiffness. It does, however, come at the cost of extra machine time, material cost, and complexity. It is thus less common than the straight, triple-sided hollow ground blades. The bilobate guard, as you can see here, provides more protection for the hand than the single clamshell. It does, however, wear against your uniform. It is a case of priorities. In the case of a training weapon like this, it makes sense to have slightly more protection, and so a bilobate guard is used. It is also worth noting that this has finger rings that are actually large enough to use if you so choose to. However, there is ample space to hold it without utilizing them. The cross-section on this blade is actually a flattened diamond, and if it continued all the way to the hilt, this would not be a small sword regardless of its hilt. It would be an Epee du Soldat. Epee du Soldat was a term created by the French in the 18th century describing a sword for a soldier. These used small sword-like hilts that were built up to be more useful in the military and had diamond cross-section blades. These had some cutting capacity and were generally a fairly well executed concept of a spadrille. However, they were double-edged. I do not have an example of an Epee du Soldat, however you can see here that this is obviously not a hollow ground triangular cross-section. A full review on this small sword is upcoming. Having spoken a little bit about the design of this sword, let's delve deeper into what a Colichemarde is. There is some argument amongst the community, including Matt Easton of Schola Gladiatoria, as to what the purpose of a Colichemarde blade is. Back in the day, before HEMA exploded, it was thought that it provided more defensive capabilities against heavier swords, like sabers and backswords. However, Matt argues that that is not the case, as having a wider blade, with thin edges, like the sharp examples have, does not necessarily confer much of a benefit. There is, however, a significant difference if we looked at it at a physical level, in that the wider blade is often stiffer, and in fact the ridge often comes up a little bit taller than on the narrow bladed examples like this. That increased stiffness changes the way the blade flexes, biasing it towards the tip of the blade. However, this is a rather small difference when it comes to handling the sword, mattering more in terms of durability, thrust over thrust over thrust. It is worth noting that many of those Colichemarde blades do have more militarized hilts, being slightly heavier and more akin to this than this. And that brings us to our next bit of discussion, design and weight. Both of these blades are about 1 meter long, with this one here being about 2 centimeters longer, most of which can be put down to the fact that the handle is quite long. Their blades are of even lengths. This one weighs around 444 grams, and this weighs about 640 grams. And most of that weight is in the handle. The blades are not too different. This has very thick steel used here on the guard, and importantly, on the finger rings and knuckle bow. It's worth noting that, as said before, many people choose not to use the finger rings on these swords, instead choosing to place their hands with the pommel in the swell of their palm, and just holding the blade over the finger rings, or perhaps slightly touching them instead of choked up. This gives you slightly more range and very good tip control. The blade here has rather thick edges down at the base, being about 4 millimeters. However, it's worth noting that this is very different in a training sword like this Castille Armoury than a historical sharp or pointed sword like this one here, which is closer to about 7 millimeters. The reason for that is that we value flexibility in this and stiffness in the actual pointed version. But this does bring me to a point, which is rather a tangent, on the way swords are made for modern practitioners. And that's that many of the people making them choose to use very thin bar stock to grind their blades from, as it saves them money and time. As a result, many of these balance wrongly, perhaps not in the wrong spot, but in the wrong way. There are many ways to keep a point of balance around the point you want it, in this case, this range. One of those ways is to use a thin blade of rather even thickness and build up very heavy fittings in order to bring the point of balance back. Another way you can do it is using a rather thick blade at the base which tapers sharply towards the point. I can understand why that's not done with the blunt versions, which are made for safety and have to be flexible. However, it's something you also see on sharps. In many sharp swords made for modern collectors, you'll see that they only have about 5mm of thickness at the base, and in many cases this is wrong. One of the key examples of this is rapiers. Rapiers, from the ones I have seen and handled, should have a blade around 8mm to a centimetre in thickness at the base, and they should taper very sharply in the first section near the fort, and then more gradually in the rest of the blade. This has very important effects on the flexibility of the fort and on the overall weight distribution and harmonics of the blade, and most significantly on the flexibility. You see, the tangs of these swords are the weak point of these swords, and as a result you want to have this area be rather strong in order to limit the chance of that breaking. By putting a very thick fort and having a somewhat thicker tang, you can achieve much more than just having a wider tang, given the plane that these flex in. Having ranted a little bit about modern blade design, we've looked at this close up to the camera. Let me bring this closer to the camera and we can discuss some of its features and give you a look at it for a view of what's available for a modern HEMA practitioner. The hilt of this sword is rather built up. As you can see, the steel is all about 3mm thick, and here it swells up to be around 1/2 centimetre wide. The pommel is solid, and apologise for all the rust, it gets handled regularly. It is threaded and the tang is around 3.5mm wide in this portion, and the thread is fairly long. I've installed these leather washers just for a little bit of extra compression. Let me pull them off. The handle is made of wood and is actually symmetrically and straight drilled. All flexibility is mitigated by this flat section here, which has the same taper, or rather lack of taper, as the inside of the handle. You can see that this is actually welded on here in what could be considered a rat tail tang. However, it is very strong, at least for the use in a small sword. A cutting sword would have different priorities. Contrary to historical small swords, this is all one piece constructed. The knuckle bow is welded on, in fact you can still see the tempera colours here, to the guard. The guard provides fairly good cover for the hand. However, it does have lots of gaps in it that blades could get into, and this is to reduce weight. As I said, this is already a fairly heavy small sword, around 640 grams. The blade here, with its Castille Armoury mark, is not overly thick, and it features the aforementioned flattened diamond cross-section, tapering straight from the end of the Colichemarde swell, which is completely flat and lacking the traditional ridge you'd expect to see. This has been Epee Swords, and we've been talking today about Colichemarde swords, in this case a Castille Economy line small sword. A link if you want to buy one will be in the description. I have used this one rather extensively and can recommend it. It's held up admirably well, apart from the small amount of rust to the pommel which I'm too lazy to scrub off. If you enjoyed this, please stay tuned as we have quite a few more videos coming the rest of this week. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to my channel and leave any comments and questions you have below in the comment section.